Welcome to Unnumbered. I'm your host, Dr. Amy, lifestyle medical doctor, speaker, and coach. I'm here to remind you that you are unique, rare, and one of a kind, and so is your health. So be prepared to be educated, inspired, and empowered to live a healthy and purposeful life. I am super excited today to be with Rachel Harris, who is an incredible woman who I recently got to physically meet on a online mind medicine training. So very important lady who has a lot of wisdom and knowledge to share with you today. Rachel is a psychologist of 40 years. She has had 10 years in academic research. She's done 40 scientific studies, and even won an award through the National Institute of Health as a new researcher, investigator. And Rachel lives between Maine and San Francisco. And today we're going to be talking a lot about plant medicines, in particular, I believe, ayahuasca. This podcast is here for educational and personal kind of conversations. It's not a ticket to say, hey, let's go and find someone to do underground ayahuasca ceremonies or other plant medicines for that matter. Please take everything that we say as a resource of trying to understand more about these plant medicines, which don't really have much voice in the scientific community just yet. But hopefully Rachel is going to give us a lot more insight. So hello, Rachel.
Hi, Amy. I'm glad to be here with you.
I'm very, very excited, as you can tell. So I feel so grateful because as I was just saying to you before we started recording, for me, as a medical doctor and someone that's had some personal experience in legal countries to do plant medicines, I've found that there isn't many women discussing plant medicines. And so when I came across you, and now you're here today, it's very exciting so that you can impart some knowledge on me, and you've got at least another four times research and background than I ever have. So I am so excited to hear what you have to say. So obviously, I've explained your background a little bit. Can you tell me a bit about how did you get into plant medicines? You're doing psychology. Like, what then pushed you towards doing or looking into plant medicines?
Well, the context is for my psychotherapy practice that I had been at Esalen Institute in California, in Big Sur, California, in the late 60s. So this is, more than half a century ago. It's a very long time ago. And during that time, I was in a special residential program that went on for 5 months. And then I remained on the staff. And there were many entheogens there. We called them psychedelics at the time. This is 68 to 71 or 2. And so I was 21. I mean, I was very young at this time. So I had exposure to these medicines then. And, then I had to go to graduate school and have a family and have a life. And so there wasn't much room for a journey. However, when my daughter was finishing graduate school, I was living in New Jersey, which maybe in Australia you can understand is a miserable place in January and February. And I was looking for a beach vacation. And so a friend had told me about a retreat center between the jungle, the rainforest jungle, and the Pacific Ocean. So I thought that sounded wonderful. Whatever the retreat was, I could just ignore them and do what I wanted for a week. So it sounded great. And the day before I left, somebody called me who had been doing the logistics to get to this very remote retreat center. And they said, do you want to participate in the ceremonies? And I said, what ceremonies? I didn't recognize the description of that retreat week. Nothing rang a bell. I was just going to go and ignore everybody. And so they said, well, these are ayahuasca ceremonies. I had happened to have a book by Ralph Metzner on my bookshelf that I, of course, had not read. And so I said, well, give me 24 hours and I'll call you back. So I read the book and I called her back and I said, yes, sign me up, because this was my life looping back to my early 20s. It was a wonderful integration for me of my own life. And I was coming out of the householder stage of life with a family and being a parent and raising a daughter. So I had it was my first ayahuasca experience. It was very powerful and I had a wonderful healing experience. So and there were a couple of ceremonies that week. I come back to the States and I call all my old hippie friends and I say, I found the fountain of youth. We have to go back. So, we all went back the next year. So I sort of fell into it and I felt like, oh, this medicine is calling me. I had no idea what I was signing up for. So I really did feel called. And of course, I followed up with ceremonies in California. Even though I was living on the East Coast, I would visit friends in California. And, I found someone indigenously trained and worked with a couple of different shaman and continued. So now it's about almost 20 years. And so when I was at the MAPS conference and I met this somebody introduced me to this young guy and he says hello and then he says, and what's your medicine? This is like asking, what's your astrological sign now? And I was a little taken aback, but it was a MAPS conference. So I said, well, I'm afraid my medicine is ayahuasca. So this is really, my medicine and I don't do well with it. And every ceremony I say, I'm never going to do this again. And as I get older, 20 years is a long time working with it. As I've been aging with ayahuasca, I've been reducing the dose because I don't need much. I recognize sort of my body knows where to go. So that I feel like I fell into this relationship with ayahuasca.
And I think a lot of people that I've spoken to say that, and then as you mentioned, you do it once or twice, and if you get a lot of people mention that calling, that feeling that you need to go back. And it's interesting how you said, it's not necessarily a joyful thing to be like, hey, I'm going back into ceremony. It's actually really hard work.
It's hard work, and it's yes.
Yeah, it feels very much like you're uncovering each layer or an onion of yourself, and obviously there's dark and light to all of us, and often in my experience it's been seeing a lot of my shadow, and you mentioned that when you've had some profound experiences. Can you share? I mean, it's not all about the actual physical experience itself, because we know, which we'll talk about, like it's the integration and the aftermath of actually the experience. But can you share anything personally that's been really kind of life-changing for you that you felt whilst you've been in ceremonies or in journeys?
Well, I can share the story that you read in the book, Listening to Ayahuasca, because this was my very first ceremony, and it was one of the most powerful. And that my first ceremony was in 2005. My father died in 1999. So 6 years later, I'm sitting in ceremony, and I had some unfinished business with my father when he was in the process of actively dying. I had brought him home to my home on hospice care, and I was walking through the house toward his room. He was no longer speaking at that point. And all of a sudden, I leave my body and I like a rocket ship, I zoom up through the roof of the house, up into the cosmos. I mean, I'm gone. And I got scared. There were no medicines involved. It was just regular life. And I got scared and I brought myself back down, sat right down in a chair. And then my father died the next day, and I never felt finished. What would have happened if I had gone? Would I have actually died with him? Would I have connected with him in some way? It was always unfinished for me. And it was very frightening because I had hallucinations. The walls were rippling. I was out of my body looking down, and the walls were moving like they move in an earthquake. All of a sudden, they're rubbery. And it really terrified me. So in the ayahuasca ceremony, my first one, my intention was to go back to this very special time when my father was dying. And I did. And I relived the last conversation with him when he could still talk, which is the I love you conversation. And, this is wonderful to have another chance to do this. And then again, I shot up out of my body. And this time I went with it because I was prepared and I wasn't afraid I was going to die. And I shot up into the cosmos. It was like a rocket ship. And there I am in the big void, the starry night sky, and I can see twinkling stars. And I'm just, I'm just, going. And that's all I remember. I mean, I think this is the disillusion of the ego. So I don't have memory after that. Years later, that's 2005. Years later, like just a couple of years ago, so more than 15 years later, I'm sitting with the shaman I work with, and he happens to be Anglo, but he was raised in an indigenous village, and he lived there for the first 15 years of his life. And his godfather was the shaman, and that's who trained him. And so he happens to be English speaking, but he's indigenously trained. His parents were missionaries. That's how he got born into an indigenous village. And he's talking about how he was singing to someone when they were in the process of dying. And he's, and his songs are Icaros. You know from working with the Shipibo that the songs are the medicine as much as the medicine is the medicine. And so he's really singing them across. We're sitting in a restaurant, and he starts sort of poetically describing, he's singing them across this starry sky. And I'm like, I was there. I know that sky. And it was so much fun that he was describing what I guess the Tibetans would call a bardo, the process of dying. I mean, I don't know. I haven't done it yet, but it was so clear that I recognized it. And so it was just this wonderful moment. And I, of course, immediately asked him, when I die, will you sing for me? And of course he said yes. So, I mean, just a wonderful thought of that we could have that kind of, that the Icaros could carry us as we're shifting states of being. We don't know what comes next. So that was my initial experience. And then what happened years later, these things stay with you and they change. I mean, when we talk, if I could just keep going, when we talk about integration, this is another level of integration that happened 15 years after the ceremony.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
Integration is about life. It's not 3 or 4 sessions and then you're done. And it's not about being coached, or it's how life unfolds, and these experiences become a part of who we are, and they become richer and deeper and more a part of our essence.
It's so interesting, you mentioned about like the integration, because so many people talk about their journeys, and they're usually profound, and we can describe them and we could write books all about them. But it's really, as you said, it's the aftermath. It's what happens. It's the integration afterwards. And as a psychologist, and for yourself, and for me, who's studying to be a psychedelic assisted therapist, it's such an interesting space where, as someone in a medical model, the differences that will be that I can already foresee that as a doctor or as a psychedelic assisted therapist versus the indigenous ceremonies in groups with Icaros and music and the intuitive abilities of the medicine men and shamans. Like, what's your concern or your pros and cons of medical versus, an indigenous native use of these plant medicines?
Well, we need everything. We need everything. Let's just, we're in such trouble. We need everything. The mental health problems are so epidemic. We need all the help we can get. So I'm very supportive of the medical research. The data is incredible. And yes, it's completely different from the indigenous healing approach. Completely different. And it's really symptom-based to reduce symptomatology and to be so that you no longer qualify as depressed or PTSD. And people who have suffered for a couple of decades, what a wonderful healing, how wonderful that is for them. My heart is with the indigenous ceremonies. I mean, with a shaman, because there's a level of healing that's that goes beyond that symptom reduction. And so for myself personally, I see the medicines as sort of a healing for different stages of life. So I started in 2005. In 2010, I retired. I had been in psychotherapy private practice for 35, 40 years by that time. I retired. And I don't quite remember, how much time passed, but I remember a weekend with two indigenous ceremonies back to back. And I just cried both nights. And it was this crying for all the sorrows and pain that I had listened to for 40 years. And I felt like, oh, I'm taking care of myself. I'm on top of my practice. I never overworked. I wasn't working for the money. I felt like I had a really good practice and a good approach. And still listening to all those stories, when I stopped, I had some cleansing to do, some spiritual cleansing to do. And that weekend of ayahuasca ceremonies with an indigenous shaman, where I just cried and cried. It was just like crying for the world and the sorrows of the world. And so that has nothing to do with a diagnosis or my symptomatology. But it's a clearing that the shamans talk a lot about, cleaning and clearing and removing. They remove things that they see in symbols. So they talk about removing dragons or black spots, or, they have these poetic ways of describing removing some energy that they want to get rid of. There's a family of shamans that I've worked with where they say people come and they might do three ceremonies in a week. And the first two ceremonies are just about clearing the path for healing. It's just shoveling the shit, basically, is what they say, getting that stuff out of the way. And then they can finally have space to do some healing work. So, it's a whole different perspective.
It's so interesting that you mentioned about, it's not based on a diagnosis or, anxiety or depression, which is the medical model. That at the moment, obviously, ayahuasca is illegal currently in Australia and many places around the world.
Yeah, everywhere but Peru. Yeah, and some of the Latin American countries. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because the reality is that health professionals, doctors, nurses, psychologists, healers in whatever capacity that people work in, they hold and they contain a lot of people's sorrow and grief and things like that.
Yes, we do. Yes.
Yeah. And so, and being somewhat an empath, I would say a lot of medical people are empaths. And then we look at the history of medicine before industrial eras. We were shamanic people. We were medicine men and women, and we weren't just there for ailments. We were there for spiritual counsel, right? And so I find it fascinating, because in order to be someone, let's say a psychedelic assisted therapist in a legal framework, let's say working with MDMA and psilocybin, which is currently now been legalized for psychiatrists to prescribe. So, working as a PAT or a psychedelic assisted therapist, the question is like how much we have healed as therapists. What have we done to look at our shadow and who we are? And I find this such an interesting question when I've sat with people in MAPS at the conferences and researchers and people who have had no experience with psychedelics, but then are being trained through a book or trained through an online program to work with patients, and how can they give their reassurance or understand what it might be like to someone that's about to have psychedelics if they've never had them themselves. How do you feel about that? What's your opinion?
Well, I have a hunch I feel exactly the same way you do about that. I know we need a lot of people all of a sudden to be able to do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. I mean, one even just superficial, maybe it's not superficial. One concern I have is that people are calling themselves psychedelic therapists, and maybe they've had a couple of ketamine sessions because they're working with ketamine. Well, first of all, ketamine isn't a psychedelic, right? And so there's some confusion here about am I a psychedelic therapist even though I'm only working with ketamine and have almost no real psychedelic experience, and yet I call myself a psychedelic? This is problematic, and it's part of the confusion that's happening around this whole new opening that's happening so fast with psychedelics. So I'm old school. I mean, the Swimming in the Sacred book is based on interviews with women elders, and they all had very extensive experience with psychedelics before they began working with others. And I think the more experience you can have yourself, the better off you are. And that yes, that includes psychedelics of all kinds and at all levels of dosages, but it also includes psychotherapy. And I don't know how it is in Australia, but therapists, including psychiatrists in the States, do not have to have their own therapy necessarily.
Wow.
So yes, wow.
Yeah. It should almost just be a prerequisite that
yes,
you
and
need
it's clearly not. It's absolutely not. So I think the more healing the person can do with entheogens, with psychotherapy, the better they'll be able to keep their own stuff out of the session. And this is true in psychedelic assisted therapy. It's true in just regular psychotherapy as well. Yeah, I want people to understand that it takes at least 6-7 years to be given permission to do an ayahuasca ceremony as a shaman. 6 or 7 years of intensive training, sitting at the elbow of the shaman, not just 6 or 7 years of a trip to Peru every once in a while. 6 or 7 years of, being right by their side.
Yeah, I completely agree. Here in Australia, it's an interesting landscape because there's quite a bit of underground ceremonies going on, which have very little screening or integration before those ceremonies. And so I think that is a dangerous space that isn't necessarily, as you said, held by people that might actually be able to work or see or know the plant medicine very well. And I think it's similar to what you were mentioning about ketamine versus things like ayahuasca. There's a synthetic compound versus something that's grown naturally from Mother Earth, right? And
completely different.
Completely different. And I'd love you to go a bit more into the kind of unseen forces of plant medicine, because I think the reductionist view of using any, let's say, for example, psilocybin mushrooms, which is now legal here through psychiatrists, using something that is naturally grown and then chemicalizing it. And, where does that leave us from removing the spirit of the plant and how that might interact or how that might affect, people's actual progress with these medicines? Because really we're taking away what I believe, and probably what you believe, is probably one of the main components of using them. So what's your opinion with regards to
that? My opinion is not worth much, but I've talked to a lot of people and I've listened to a lot of people is a better way to say
I don't agree that it's not worth much.
No, this is I can tell you this is above my pay grade, but I can tell you what other people say. And so that is, if there's someone was, it could have been, I don't remember who was developing this research study, but they wanted to use indigenous shaman in ceremony with ayahuasca. But to control for research purposes the dosage and potency of the plant, they used freeze-dried ayahuasca, which is the way they use it in the studies in Spain and in Brazil. So when they showed these capsules to the shaman, the shaman refused to participate in the study. They said the spirit is no longer in that capsule. So there you have it from the shaman themselves. I was just reading, and I was telling you earlier, it rained all day, so I was reading, and there was uh, quotes from shaman. It was the Shuar tribe, and they were saying it's not the chemical of the ayahuasca, it's the whole, it's the shaman and the energy that's coming through. It's not like taking an aspirin or regular medicines. It's the whole experience and what the shaman is able to do with the help of the medicine.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that kind of leads on to, again, the differences between the medical model, which obviously I'm all for. I'm all for trying to get this to a wider audience, right? My aim is definitely not that everyone just takes plant medicines underground because of the dangers. But similar to what you're saying, like one of my visions and missions is to have a space and allow people in communities to work with these medicines in a medical format, but the current protocols and processes look like a patient sitting in a clinic room, which isn't necessarily completely associated with nature or in nature. It might be white walls, and it might have a bit of background, nice ambient music, and it might be dimly lit. And then it's with two psychotherapists, right? Or two psychedelic assisted therapists, which is very different to what you may experience in an indigenous experience. And I just wonder what elements we can take from the indigenous, how can we bridge the two? Because the aim isn't to try and be divided. The aim is to try and come together with research and with spiritual knowledge, right? So what do you think, even with regards to music or Icaros, do you think there's a place where we can form good, strong relationships with elders and shamans and bring them into these types of models that maybe we have a beautiful retreat on 100 acres that's connected to nature? Like, do you think that might be something that will bridge the gap, or what can you see? Or do you see it going sideways and then being completely separate?
Well, I think, if you were to seek a therapist, if you wanted to go into psychotherapy for yourself, there's a whole array of different approaches. And you want a male therapist or a female therapist? What degree do you want? Do you want a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker? What orientation do you want from them? What specialty do they have? You have this huge choice. It's like a whole array. And I would love for the medicines to be available in that kind of way, that there would be traditional shamanic ceremonies with people who have studied for significant amounts of time. I really am a traditionalist when it comes to ayahuasca. I think the shamans really know how to use it, and I'm a little snotty, and I have to catch myself about this, because I remember talking to one guy who went to some kind of ceremony, and I said, well, what was the music? He said, oh, well, he had a great playlist. He had CDs. And already I'm like, oh, that's, terrible. He got so much benefit from it. And so I thank God I kept my mouth shut, which was a miracle for me. And it was just so helpful to him. And it was a big experience. So I want to make room for that. But in my heart, I like the traditional ceremonies. But I think I'd love for people to have choices. And they do have choices now, but some of them are kind of scary. And one of the things I say is, don't go to anyone who doesn't do a really extensive medical interview. The truth is, the women, the elders who I interviewed, who are working underground, they do extensive interviews, and they consult with medical doctors and psychopharmacologists. They're not alone in their practice. They are connected to other professionals. If they feel like this person needs therapy after the ceremony, they refer to a therapist who understands this area. it's not like, I've had a great experience. Now I'm going to, sit for other people. And I don't have any connections. There's real professional networks of people working and supporting each other. And you want to go to someone who's connected in that way. And one of the most surprising things, which is the flip side of this, is and this story is so crazy that I even don't know how to explain it. But there's this family of shaman from a Shipibo tribe who I've worked with them in ceremonies on Zoom. I talk about this in the Swimming in the Sacred book because I think it's a crazy idea and I can't believe it works, and it works. I don't drink the ayahuasca. They drink the ayahuasca and sing over Zoom. And it works. And it's two brothers and the elder brother's wife. So there are three shamans. The three shamans sing to each of the people in the ceremony. They have a clinical meeting before the event. So they know who's coming, who's going to be on Zoom. They know the patients. They're very professional. They talk about what they're going to do with each patient. They coordinate their intention with each patient. So there was a ceremony. I wasn't present in this one, but there was a particularly difficult case in the group. And the shamans decided each of us will sing to him first. And he talked to me about his experience afterwards. And he said, I don't know what hit me, but I just had tears running down my face for 6 hours. And that was because they really focused on him because they knew they hadn't yet reached him. So there's this sort of staff consultation. This is just, I spent some time in training in a psychiatric hospital in Boston, and this was a case presentation. And so they coordinated their efforts in the treatment intervention to target this one guy, and they opened him up. I mean, and so, it's so the shamans have a professionalism that we can even understand from our clinical training. And so, someone who's working alone, who doesn't have much experience and doesn't have colleagues, doesn't have any supervision, doesn't have anyone who's kind of, if they're upset about something, they can go talk to them, a professional. Or even people are doing some of these medicines alone. I've heard of people drinking ayahuasca home alone. I honestly don't understand this. The medicine is in the shamans channeling the energy. So,
and the thread between the circle of participants, often in indigenous ways, right, is an element of mirroring, or people having very similar problems. That was my experience in Peru, that many people would voice their problems, and I wouldn't need to say anything because I could have said the same thing.
They covered the territory. Yes,
true,
amazing
right?
things happen in the group. Yes.
Yeah. And so just going back to like women, what do you see as, obviously men and women both work with ayahuasca? Like, what do you feel like women can offer with plant medicines? Because it is in my experience sometimes that women aren't always as appreciated in the Western culture with plant medicines, but in indigenous, there's very much a nurturing, a very intuitive sensing that women in particular can bring from that divine feminine. So what can you share with regards to women and what they can offer in the plant space?
Well, when I started to interview elders who had been working underground, I made a decision to only interview women. And it was because I felt they had a deeper relationship with the plant spirits. This is not to say that the men don't have that relationship as well. Certainly the indigenous shaman do. But that the underground women had a more intuitive relationship, I felt. That they talked about that relationship more, that it was more present in them, whether or not they had any medicine in them, that it was an ongoing relationship, not dependent on the chemical in them. It's interesting, when I describe these 3 shamans that I work with, and the one is a woman, and she doesn't even, this is the wife of the elder brother. This woman doesn't speak Spanish even. She speaks the indigenous language in the village, the Shipibo language of that village. So, she's not traveled she hasn't traveled anywhere. And yet she conveys something in her singing that is not present in the men. And there's an earthy joyousness. Now, this is my experience with one woman who's a shaman, but it's very unique. And I mean, I have absolutely nothing in common with this woman. She's got grandchildren at the age of 40. I was 40. I was almost 40 when I had a daughter. And yet there's something extraordinary about her work with the Icaros. And I do, I don't want to say her songs or her singing, because really it's more like almost screeching. It's not harmonious at all. It's not a beautiful Icaros, but there's and yet it brings me such joy. It's totally irrational as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's very good for me because I don't understand it at all. But there is I can send you a link to a YouTube of, this is an academic. He's got a PhD from a university in Montreal, but he's from Chile originally, but he married into a Shipibo tribe. And so now he's a member of a tribe. And so he can talk from being inside the tribe, and he talks about how the Icaros work. And I'll send you the link on YouTube. It's just 10 minutes, and it is the best description of the medicine of the Icaros. Because
wow.
we are not we're not respecting the traditional shamanic work enough. It's not just the ayahuasca. It's not just the DMT. It's really the medicine that the shaman brings through with the Icaros.
And it's interesting you talk about Icaros, because in my experience is that I've never been a singer ever, and I don't actually even like my voice. But interestingly, when I've worked with plant medicines, the voice seems to open up, the channels open up, and it's almost like you don't have the fear to use your voice. And even just like arming and humming and mantras, they just have this almost ecstatic, blissful, pleasurable experience that I can't really describe when I'm not using plant medicines. And when the way that you describe Icaros is very I suppose I resonate with it in the sense that when a shaman has come up to me and sang the Icaros, it's like a match under a lot of wood. It's like suddenly it's like the medicine was at level 1, and then the Icaros comes, or the music comes, and suddenly it's like 10. It's the activation. It's working, right? So it's really interesting to see how we can bridge that, and how we can have a look at using music in a medical format, in the way in which we're going to be using psychedelics in the future. So tell me a bit more about the women that you were interviewing. They were elders. What were their age ranges? Like these people have been working with plant medicines for a long time.
Most of them had been working for 30 or 40 years. My inclusion criteria for the research was 20 years, but they'd been working double that. So the eldest, I call her the eldest of the elders. She's now 90. So when I interviewed her, she was 86. And one of the younger ones, who had trained in Peru with a Shipibo shaman, was early 60s. But most of them were around 70 something. But that was the range. Yeah.
And just like, what's your experience? Because obviously that's heading more to the elderly population. What's your experience with using the plant medicines in children in native countries? Because what I've heard is that it's used from young ages. It's almost like a part of life in the Amazon.
Yes, I think it is. We know very little about this. Yes, we do know that it is used.
Yeah.
And it's different in different tribes, but this has not been studied, and it makes me a little nervous, but this is a totally different culture. So, that's my culture bound response.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot we don't yet know. With ayahuasca itself, like, what's some of the research or academic benefits that you've seen? Obviously, there's lots of case studies that's written in your books. But is there anything specifically from your point of view that you've felt medically from a research perspective that you can share with us about specifically ayahuasca?
Yeah. The studies from Spain and from Brazil are pretty specific for depression. That it's helpful for depression. But the at conferences, I've heard veterans talk about here's how they describe it. They say, I used marijuana to get off of all the prescription medicines. And often they say in the VA, in the United States, it's the Veterans Administration, I had more than 20 prescriptions. The doctors just kept giving them different drugs. And they wanted to get off everything. And they used marijuana to get off everything. And then they went to the jungle to do ayahuasca to heal. And I think that's a pretty good recipe. And so that's a healing that's not just for PTSD. Of course, that's part of it. But there's a spiritual healing that happens with ayahuasca that that I think the veterans are reporting, that they've suffered. Yes, they have PTSD and they have depression and anxiety and the whole thing, but there's a spiritual suffering that they have, that ayahuasca is what touches that. And then it when they do it in groups, then you get also this group healing that you reference, that you talk about, where they're journeying together and supporting each other, and they know what each is going through. So I think that's what the veterans say. But the research studies themselves really point toward a treatment for depression. And I think we're just learning about the different medicines. Experientially, the medicines take us to different realms. They're very different. And which medicines are better for which sorrow, which suffering. And I think we're just learning. It could even be the ketamine is better for depression, but it might be to knock the depression or suicidal thoughts out and then do healing work with we just don't know all the combinations. And I think it's too complicated for research to be able to do controlled studies. I think people will have to find their own way. And so the best thing I can say is be very careful who you trust, who you put yourself in the hands of, and take your time. People sometimes feel, well, I have to go do this. Take your time, go slow. And also don't do a whole bunch of things all at one time. When I spend the winter in the San Francisco Bay Area, there are ceremonies everywhere every weekend. And this one guy was going to a different ceremony every night, different medicines. And the shaman he was working with just said, go do everything. And then when you're finished with that, you can come back to me. But don't come. And he was really saying, don't bring that mixed up energy into my ceremony. Go do it. Go, experience everything. And then when you want to really study with ayahuasca, come back to me. And there is this sense of plant teachers, and that we have to learn from the plants.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that because my main work is with medicinal cannabis, and it's interesting that anyone that comes to plant medicines, as you said, they can try and seek that quick kind of gratification of a hit, whether that's from cannabis or from another plant medicine. And I think that's a really important point because as psychedelics become, we're in this plant renaissance, and it's kind of hip and everyone's talking about it, and so therefore there are those people that will go, like you said, every weekend or every other night,
Yes,
to try and do something, but are you truly respecting the plant? And as you know, in shamanic, in order to become shamans, most people do dietas. So you refrain from chocolate, certain meat, intimacy for 3-6 months before you do ceremonies. So, I think it's so interesting, again, that Western culture, quick gratification versus
yes, absolutely.
right?
Right,
And
right.
I really like how you talk about discernment. Tell me a bit more about discernment with using with plant medicines, because you talk about that also in your book.
Yeah. There's a phrase that I've heard. I have a friend who's been studying for 6 years with the shamans, Shipipo shamans in Peru. And he says the question is, what do the plants want? So there's this listening to the plants to receive sort of a guidance and working. There's this ongoing relationship with the plants that goes beyond the ceremony, and that's what is cultivated. So and the plants will, if you have the humility of a student to listen, to work with a plant teacher, then you're in the right relationship, and there's a guidance that happens. And I remember interviewing this one guy, and he said ayahuasca told him to stop doing cocaine. Big surprise, right? And he said, and I didn't listen to her. And he said, I felt so guilty. I couldn't come back to her for months. Then finally I stopped the cocaine, and then I could come back and do a ceremony. So, it's this relationship with a sort of a give and take, and some humor and some tough lessons as well. So I think the discernment is, yes, from within, from our own intuition, from our own thinking and clarifying our own intellectual process and making decisions, and also in relationship to the plant teacher.
Yes, I completely agree. And another thing that's in your book is about practicing for death and dying, which, as you, I think, as a reader, you might be like, oh, like that's a little bit of a scary, sensitive subject for most people. Tell me a bit about that with regards to psychedelics and ayahuasca.
Well, ayahuasca is called the vine of the dead, so this is her specialty. This is part of what has not really been explored in the academic research studies. They're so focused on not just the symptomatology, but on the mystical experience, that they're missing. They haven't really begun to collect data on the experience that most people have of meeting and communicating with somebody, a loved one who's died. And this is extremely healing. I mean, it opens that veil. It presents a whole different way of thinking about life after death. And many times there's a resolution of a relationship, or a final, I love you, or, resolving things unsaid. I mean, one young man who was just in his early 40s, he had a childhood friend who killed himself when he was in his early 20s. And that's very hard to recover from a suicide of a close friend. And he said in an ayahuasca ceremony, he had this conversation with him. He saw that his friend was doing well, looked good, and was resolved, and explained his suicide. And it really resolved the survivor guilt that he had, and the worry and that kind of thing. So there's this whole realm of, yes, preparing for one's own death, but also crossing that boundary and talking to people. I think it's the research from NYU that's doing the most using psilocybin with terminal cancer patients. And, they shift. It's the symptom that they're treating is, I think, demoralization. When someone is dying and they're just completely demoralized, it's even more than depression, but it's what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about when the patient they turn their back on everyone and they face the wall. They sort of die while they're still alive, and they're unavailable to their loved ones, to resolve things, to enjoy the time they have left. And with even just one good psilocybin trip, people use their last remaining weeks, months with much more life and much more relationship to their loved ones, and their whole attitude toward death changes. And so it's really I hate to say it's a miracle drug. It doesn't cure the cancer they're dying of, but their experience of the end of their life is completely different. So they can really live with the time they have left. And one woman said, I'm an atheist, but I don't have another way of saying this. I was rocked in the loving arms of God. So that's an experience that changes one's life.
Yeah, completely. And so many people mention that feeling of death, whether that's ego or just a feeling that they disappeared and as if they weren't going to come back. But then they often come back and say, that they are not scared of death anymore.
It changes that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like feeling as if it sounds cliche, but a lot of people mention just kind of feeling like you're a part of everything. And so it's that you're not really disappearing as such, which I find very reassuring for me, that there's something other than this life, and whether people believe that or not. But when you face and see death and birth so frequently, which I've done in my career, there's an element of that there's a passing over, and I truly do believe that, and I think it offers a lot of hope for people, and there's not many things that offer hope in this.
Yes,
in this
that's
world.
Exactly right. And these the entheogens kind of we shift, that our worldview shifts. We have a different cosmology. We see life differently, and these medicines are used in vivo at different stages of life. So yeah, just for me, so I used entheogens when I was in my early 20s, always in nature and spiritually, but not the same as I do now at this stage of life. And so it really it helps us make major shifts so that we experience ourselves and our relationship to our lives and the world very differently.
And just going back to the women that you've interviewed in your book, The Elders, was there any concerns from them to kind of share what they've been doing and worrying about how this is going to be portrayed to people? Were they pretty open, or how were they when you were interviewing them?
They had never talked to anybody before. They had a code of silence, so they never talked to anyone. And I promised them I would send the manuscript to them before I gave it to my editor. And of course I did that. And I used pseudonyms, so their identities are protected. They are still working underground. One woman said, even if these medicines become legal, I would continue to work underground because that's where the sacred container is. They're not therapists. They're more like priestesses. So they're not shaman. One or two have been trained by indigenous shamans, but generally they're sort of like spiritual priestesses. They have across the board of them, they were kind of fearless, afraid of nothing. And so they're very experienced. And this is a very serious business. So one of them told me a story of when she had to take someone to an emergency room. So that means she was professional enough to know we have to go to an ER and I have to take you and I have to explain to the doctor what you're on. And I have to risk the doctor calling the cops on me because I'm reporting something illegal. She happened to find a simpatico doctor in the ER. So the person was treated and she was safe. But this is very serious business for both the client and the practitioner. So it's this is not something done casually. They've done their own apprenticeships, and one of the women said, ask, if you're going to work with someone, ask them who authorized you to serve this medicine. What's your lineage? And that's a very serious question.
And I suppose that then kind of takes me to looking again at the landscape of, how potentially ayahuasca might come into people's lives right now. And obviously there's underground, which we're not necessarily, we're not promoting, especially not in a they're not screened, etc. But also there are churches that where ayahuasca is used as a sacred sacrament, and so there's a different I suppose perspective that you're using it in a religious devotional way, and therefore obviously there's less medical intervention from that perspective. Have you ever worked or spoken to any of the women that are working in any of the spiritual churches, or have you had any experience with them?
I have. So they're Christian churches. It's the Santo Daime is legal. I don't have any experience with the UDV. They're in New Mexico, and they're quite different. And so the Santo Daime churches depend on who's the leader in the church, how they do it. But there's no question it's a Christian church. And so they work very differently. And there are hymns, and there's some mediumship. So it's quite a different cosmology from the indigenous tribal use. So it depends. That is certainly one way that ayahuasca is legal in the States, but it depends what feels right to the person. So this is some of what I mean by there's a wide array of choices, and people find their own path. But it's not like we know from research what works better. We certainly don't even know what approach to therapy works better. There's lots of conflicting research done on does therapy work at all? After spending my life practicing it and being a client, I mean, that's still a legitimate question. But so there's really a take your time and find your own way. But there are some things to be sure to be the most safe you can be. Do you have the Santo Daime Church in Australia?
I've been told of one. I haven't personally been to it, but I have been told of one. As I said, landscape here in Australia is a difficult one as to how ayahuasca may come about. I think we're a very, very long way from it being something that's accepted and respected for what it is.
Yeah.
And that's one of my missions, is to ensure that plant medicines are used devotionally and safely with the right people, and as you said, discerning. So I'm so excited to read your book. As I said, I've been reading your Listening to Ayahuasca book, but I'm super excited to read Swimming in the Sacred, which is out now, right? Where is it available?
It's out. It's everywhere. It's out.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure the listeners today have learned so much about you, and I feel super grateful to have had this kind of chat with you and have a bit more of an insight into your livelihood and what pushes you to learn these things. I feel like I'm 100 steps back from you, and I'm probably going to try and chase you up because I feel like
No, you're the hope for the future. And I thank you for your work in this world. Yeah.
So thank you so much. I'm sure we'll probably chat definitely again. But for now, if anyone wants to read the book, I will make sure that there's some links, and please leave a great review for Rachel. She's an incredible woman. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.